Recording to the cloud. Okay, I think I've clicked the right button for recording. I've got a few things first, Richard, to go through anyway. Please, everybody, ensure you are muting. With all due respect, we don't want to hear you eating your supper or talking to the dog, which has happened in the past. So please do that, because if I try and do it, I'll probably screw it up, because as most of you know, I am not the computer person. I'm the bird and automotive person. Update on our recent star bird, that lovely limpkin down in Liverpool. I and many others got lucky enough to see the bird and meet the staff and folks at the garden centre, Crosby's. Lovely people. As a thank you for hosting the birders, the society presented them, you may have seen on Facebook, with one of Jason Dane's photos printed and framed up. We've also made a donation to they've got a fund for basically extending and maintaining their trails behind there, because they don't mind birders going in and checking it out. So I'd recommend, if you're in that area, go and have a walk around the trails, and of course buy some plants, as my wife did. But anybody, it was really nice people, and we were all very honoured, those that got to see it, to see that lovely limpkin, Larry as they named it, for goodness sake. Big announcement for the night. We're having an in-person AGM again this year for the first time since before COVID. It's going to be on the 25th of November. The world has changed, and trying to find somewhere at a sensible price with good accessibility is not as easy as it used to be. This year, it's going to be held, of all places, at the Decathlon store at Micmac Mall. They have a gymnasium and meeting space. It's got great transit links, plenty of parking. We're going to have a reasonably large silent auction there, so you can bid on some pretty cool duck decoy, some really nice folk art, native art, and other goodies we're going to pull out of our storage area for that night. There will be food and drink afterwards, once I've finished with my other directors doing various reports and the actual official business, the voting, etc. So we'd love to see as many there as can, but please contact me, President of Nova Scotia Bird Society.ca, to let me know some idea of numbers, so we can get everything right for the food, etc. Also, due to the constraints of the location, the drinks afterwards will not be alcoholic. It's a non-alcoholic event, so we'll have a range of non-alcoholic Nova Scotian beers and wines, and also many different teas and coffees, which probably won't be from Nova Scotia, but they will be bird friendly. We appear to have lost Richard. Richard, come back. I'm not that scary. But we hope to see everybody at that event, and it'll be great to sort of get back together and chat to friends old and new, live, as it were, in November. And that will be on the events page very shortly. Anyway, enough of me twittering on. Over to the main event, presented by Richard Stern. 54 years of birding travels, 55 years of birding, and lots of experience and travels around the world. So let's see if we can make this work to share the screen. Okay, Richard. That's going to be my screen shared. Don't need that.
Unmuted. So there's wait a minute.
You're unmuted.
Yeah, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. Maybe if
that one, my friend.
Okay, maybe if I just bring up the slideshow. Can you see that on the screen or not?
Not yet, sir.
Okay, well, somehow you've got to allow screen sharing.
I'm getting there.
Okay.
I'm screen sharing, and I don't want to screen share.
So I want to screen share. There we go.
I know, I'm getting there.
Okay, I think that might be it there. Is that what you can see now? A big slide?
No, I can see a white thing with zoom on it, so I don't want to.
Okay.
lose everybody.
Nicely,
I will stop
I have
that.
first slide.
There
which
we
is
go. We're there.
The world.
Perfect.
All right. So the title of this talk is 54 Years of Birding Travel. I was asked by Susan, I think, to do this talk, and I had some trepidation because there are plenty of other people, some of whom are in the audience, I notice, who've actually traveled to far more exotic and weird and far-flung places than I have, and have traveled a lot more than I have. So I put in this disclaimer. Some people in the audience have been on many more trips than me. Some were also on the trips that I will mention. So if I make any mistakes or if my memory fails me, well, I apologize in advance. And I've done a lot of trips over the years. In 54 years, I've been to many places. And if you all want to stay till about 2 o'clock in the morning, I worked out, I can show you some more trips than the ones that I'm going to do in the next hour or so. But I hope you don't. Okay, so my very first birding trip was with an organization called Ornitholodays, and it was before I ever came to Canada. This was the furthest flung place I'd ever been to. It was when I first started birding, and it was the Isle of Isla. That's how it's pronounced, and it was in 1969. And Isla is in the middle. Can you see my little arrow thing here, by the way, or not?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right. So Isla is right there. You fly from Glasgow in a small plane which lands on the beach. We had a wonderful trip. It was an organized trip with a leader, and as well as interesting birds like golden eagles and huge flocks of pink-footed geese, and we had horned larks, which we thought were from the North America, and they were probably the first ones documented for the island. And things like ring ouzels, which I'd never seen before or since. If you like whiskey, that's the place to go, because there are 7 distilleries. They all make very sort of peaty whiskey, and I don't personally like whiskey. I prefer other stuff. But anyway, that was my first trip, and it gave me a sort of an idea that I would like to do more trips. So I ended up in Nova Scotia, quite a few years after that first trip. And what I'm going to do, instead of going chronologically, I'm going to sort of go around in circles. So I'm going to talk about a couple of places in North America, first of all. And the first one I'm going to talk about is a trip we did in 2019 in June. It was an organized trip through one of the big companies. We had an excellent leader, and there were only 6 people on the trip altogether, so that made it very friendly. And it was to southern Alberta, and this picture is of a mountain bluebird announcing that we were in fact in Alberta. And the trip was entitled Birds and Dinosaurs, and I'm going to mention that partly because in January the topic of the talk at this meeting is going to be somebody talking about how birds really are dinosaurs, I guess. I mean, to talk about birds and dinosaurs is almost an oxymoron, because birds are dinosaurs, but you'll hear more about that in January. Anyway, when we arrived in Calgary, Liz has a friend who lived in Calgary, so she went off to see the friend, and on my first day I went to this place called Inglewood Bird Sanctuary, and in the first 5 minutes there I saw actually 10 times more clay-colored sparrows than I'd ever seen before in my life, having seen a few in Nova Scotia and still do. And there's a clay-colored. The trip started off in basically the foothills and the prairies, and we saw birds like this beautiful Swainson's hawk sitting on a post. Yellow-headed blackbirds were really common. And as part of the trip, we went here to the Royal Tyrrell Museum for the dinosaur part of the trip. The picture on the left, we were very lucky in that our trip leader had some contacts at the Tyrrell, who worked at the Tyrrell, and so we got a tour of the back rooms where they actually process the specimens and so forth. So it's not very often that you get to actually touch and hold an actual 60+ million year bone. And this bone that this guy is comparing to Liz's arm is an actual fossil of a Tyrannosaurus rex humerus, which, as you can see, is about the same size, or at least it's a bit fatter, but it's the same length as a human humerus. And the one on the right here is just one of the specimens that they had showing the similarities between is this a small dinosaur or is it a bird? And it could be either, in fact. Just coming out of the museum afterwards, the parking lot had these guys, large gull, dark gray mantle, very parallel bill, dark eye, yellow legs. It's California gull. So look out for those in Nova Scotia if you're good at that stuff. We then went south a little way to a wonderful place if you're a photographer called Frank Lake. And here are just a couple of pictures I took. This is an American avocet with its reflection in the water. The little dots all around there are not, I don't know whether you can see them on your screens. I can see it on my laptop easily. They're not dirt on the lens, they are insects. So you have to wear appropriate clothing or insect repellent. And for those of you who've been to Amherst in the last week, you should be familiar with this bird, which is an eared grebe, but this one's in breeding plumage. For me, probably the best bird I saw at Frank Lake was this. It's a Sabine's gull, or Sabines, I'm not sure how you're supposed to pronounce it. There were actually 8 of them, all in full breeding plumage, and they were in with a flock of Bonaparte's gulls, so made it really rather nice to look at. The second part of the trip was interesting in that of the 6 people who were on the trip, 4 of them chickened out. I think one of them got sick, and the other 2 weren't planning on coming to Banff anyway, because the second part of the trip was in Banff. So good for the company, they didn't cancel the rest of the trip or anything. So the trip leader, Jody, who was a really nice guy and excellent birder and well known now because he's on the board or the Council of Birds Canada, I think, took us, just Liz and I, to Banff for 3 days. One of the things we did was go up the gondola where we saw this wonderful scenery, the Rockies. We also saw quite a few interesting birds. There's a little anecdote about this bird. Jody did the eBird reports for the whole trip. Every day or every evening we did as usual, we did a sort of a trip, a day count, and he filled out the eBird reports. And when I finally got home and had a chance to process the photos that I took, I added them to the eBird reports. This one, we sort of oohed and ahed about this bird being such a great example of an Audubon's warbler. Now, for the beginner birders or the people who aren't quite familiar with some of the sort of subtleties of this stuff, what we now call yellow-rumped warblers were at one time thought to be 2 different species. One west of the Rockies, which looked like this, with a yellow throat and basically no white on the front end of it, was one species, and it was called Audubon's warbler. And the other one, which is the one that's so familiar to us here in Nova Scotia, was called the myrtle warbler, until they discovered that there was a sort of a zone of mixing and interbreeding in central Alberta and directly south of that. And further research showed that they're actually color variants of one species, which is now just called the yellow rump warbler. So to my great surprise, a few days after I added this picture to eBird, you know, those of you who use eBird, when you go online and you click on the eBird icon, the website comes up and there's always a sort of picture of the day, a great big picture. And this was it for a few days. It's the only time it's ever happened to me. So I was really delighted. But because of that, I got an email from some local guy who is actually doing research on yellow rump warblers. And he said, that's not a pure Audubon's warbler. It's got a little bit of white just under the bill. And so it's an intergrade. It's a good example of an intergrade that looks mostly like a Audubon's, but actually is an intergrade between the 2 subspecies. So that was an interesting bird to me. We saw a number of other birds in the mountains. This is a Townsend's warbler, of course. And when you're on a trip like this, it's always nice to see a few mammals. This very furry looking guy, was right by the roadside. We were very good. We didn't try and get out to photograph it, but we did stop the van and took pictures through the window. That was Alberta. Now we're going south to Southern California. Three of us decided we wanted to go in 2007. And I know at least one of the people on that trip is in the audience tonight. I particularly wanted to go to this place, the Salton Sea, which is basically a man-made lake. It's a huge lake, which is slowly drying up. And it was created as part of the dam system on the Colorado River. And it's been used to irrigate crops. There's a vast area in Southern California there of crop growing. We get a lot of our own vegetables and fruit and so on from that area. But because of environmental degradation, it's becoming saltier and saltier, and it's slowly drying up. So we wanted to go there before it finally dried up. There's also a very peculiar city called Salton City, which is on the shore of the sea. It's full of nice-looking houses and buildings and schools and so forth, which are all totally empty. It was built for returning GIs after World War II, and it was never inhabited. Anyway, here's Ken and Alan, and we rented this vehicle in Los Angeles at LAX airport, drove down to the Salton Sea. This was my target bird that I really wanted to see. Eric, don't say a word, but does anybody else know what this is? Anyway, if you don't, it's a yellow-footed gull. It's sort of a close relative of a western gull, but it's slightly bigger. It's got yellow legs and feet. It's got a huge yellow bill with a with black on the end. And it matures in 3 years, whereas most large gulls, like herring gulls and both the blackbacks and so forth, take 4 years to mature. And in North America, it can really only be found on the edge of the Salton Sea and also in Baja in Mexico. So it's a very limited range. This is an example also at the Salton Sea of a western sandpiper in full breeding plumage. It looks quite different from our semi-palmated sandpipers in breeding plumage. But for those of you who joined the rest of us to look through flocks of 10,000 semi-palmated sandpipers, the thing you had to, in early September, when everything's in juvenile plumage, the thing you really have to look for is the length and shape of the bill. And the rest of the bird looks very like a semi-palmated, apart from, if you're lucky, you can see some of the juvenile feathers along this area here. Okay, some other shorebirds we saw down there. That's a long-billed curlew. I think there's one record for Nova Scotia, I'm not sure. We drove around looking for burrowing owls, and at first we didn't see any because we were looking across the fields through our binoculars until we realized that they were right by the roadside. So here's a nice looking burrowing owl. And of course, you can't go to California without hoping to see a roadrunner. So there's one running along a road. This is a Costa's hummingbird. And we went up into the mountains, sort of behind San Diego. It's an area where there have been a lot of forest fires in the last couple of years. The red-shouldered hawks here look a little bit different from the ones on the East Coast and in Florida. They're more brightly colored and they're more speckled. This is sort of local endemic. It's a California scrub jay. A non-bird thing that I was interested in, I have a very slight interest in astronomy, and we went to Mount Palomar, which holds the 200-inch telescope. At one time, it was the largest telescope in the world and has been responsible for all kinds of interesting astronomical discoveries. And one of the reasons I wanted to go there is here. If you can read this, I'll read it for you. Astrogeologist Eugene Shoemaker, his wife Carolyn Shoemaker, and amateur astronomer David Levy were surveying the sky in a search for comets and asteroids when they discovered a comet that had broken into bits. David Levy was an amateur astronomer from Wolfville, who was eventually associated with Acadia University. So that's a sort of, he made Acadia famous in the astronomical world. We ended up on the coast, which in California is famous for its, to most people, for its surfing, but to us for its surfbirds. Here's another interesting gull. This is a glaucous winged gull. They're relatively common from sort of where we were, which is just north of LA, up north into British Columbia and further north. Western gulls are more common further south. The two interbreed extensively, and I suspect they're probably going to be lumped as two color variations of one species. Maybe Eric or somebody could comment on that later. Okay, another trip we did in the same neck of the woods was not an organized birding trip as such, but we did lots of birding. Liz and I flew to Arizona in November of 2008. We were right in the middle of the financial crisis of 2008, so we were able to get cheap hotel rooms because a lot of people had canceled. We went to the Grand Canyon, where we were able to, at very short notice, to get a room in a hotel right on the very edge of the canyon. It's a good thing we didn't sleepwalk or anything like that. And here's a more typical picture of saguaros. And here are just four of the birds that we saw. We actually stayed at a very nice hotel that we got a relatively cheap room in a golf and tennis resort in the outskirts of Tucson. This, of course, is a vermilion flycatcher, a Harris's hawk, cactus wren, and a phainopepla. There's phainopeplars and pyroloxias, which I really think are great names for birds, and we saw both. We did a lot of sort of other stuff besides just birding. Liz was a good tennis player and had tennis lessons there. I like Western movies, so we went to Tombstone and had a great time all together. Florida, the last place in the US that I'm going to talk about, I think. We've been to Florida lots of times, and I'm sure most of you in the audience have as well. I belong to various bird photography blogs and websites and so forth, and people are always asking questions like, what is one thing that we can do to get better photographs of birds? People answer, well, buy such and such a lens or such and such a camera, or go out at 3 in the morning when the light starts to get better, or get down on your...
It was the same one that was on
Okay. And so forth. Anyway, one fellow I remember, which I thought was highly appropriate, he answered one of these questions with, if you want to get good photographs of birds, just move to Florida. And here's an example. Southern Florida is full of places like this with boardwalks. And I took this picture with my phone, not with an expensive camera or a telephoto lens. And the birds almost behave as if they're in a zoo, because they're wild, flying free birds, but you can get pretty close in some cases. Florida is famous for its water birds. Everybody wants to see roseate spoonbills, which are certainly beautiful. And for those that didn't get to Liverpool last week, here's a limpkin. Not all the birds in Florida are on water. Loggerhead shrikes, which are supposed to be threatened or endangered, at least in Canada, are actually quite common down there. And if you go late in the winter or in early spring, the migration of swallowtail kites has begun. They nest in Florida or in southern Florida, and you can see them sort of soaring around and establishing territories before they do. Now, not far from Florida, of course, is Cuba. I've been to Cuba 4 times, of which 3 were specific birding trips. And on one of them, even though it was a birding trip, we took the kids who love to whiz around on bicycles and so forth. The final one was not a birding trip, but of course, I'm never not birding when I'm on a trip somewhere. So we did a bit. And if you look carefully at this, this at the time was the field guide to birds of Cuba. And there were 2 authors. The first guy, Garrido, I think he did the pictures, and Arturo Kirkconnell did the text. And the reason I'm putting that is this picture here. There are 3 people in this picture. this guy over here on the left was our bus driver. The person in the middle was Blake Maybank, who was a member of the Nova Scotia Bird Society, keen birder in this area, and he was very good at organizing birding trips. He organized birding trips such that they were not just solid birding and nothing else from dawn till after dusk, but they went at a leisurely pace. The company and the people were equally as important. Most of the people on his trips knew each other anyway because they were locals from Nova Scotia. And things like culture and food and hotels and so on were also important. And he always got local guides to do the actual bird guiding. So this guy on the right-hand side is Arturo Kirkconnell, who wrote the book, literally, on the birds of Cuba. And he was our guide at the time. He was a super guide, except that he hardly spoke any English. And my Spanish was and is very rudimentary. And so we managed somehow. Just a few endemic birds of Cuba. This is one with a lovely name. It's called a Fernandina's flicker. And it's, of course, related to our flicker, but looks different. And it's highly endemic, endangered, and it can only be found in certain spots in the western half of the island. Here's a rather nice picture of what at the time was called a bare-legged owl and is now called a Cuban screech owl. Arturo knew of somebody who took us to this nest hole, and we were able to see the bird without disturbing it too much. Here's another local bird. We went to an area called the Zapata Swamp, which is in the southwestern part of Cuba. Most of the birding that we've done on the four birding trips that we've been to Cuba, we spent plenty of time off resort and went to other places in the country, which is far more interesting than just staying on beach resorts that could be anywhere. Anyway, the Zapata Swamp contains quite a few endemics. This is the Zapata wren, which is highly endangered. At the moment, there are thought to be about 4,000 Zapata wrens in existence anywhere in the world, and they're all here. At the time I took this picture, there were far less than that. There were thought to be about 400, so they've actually done very well. There's also a Zapata rail that, of course, we didn't see because the last time it was ever actually seen was 1946, and it's probably extinct. This is the world's smallest bird. It's a bee hummingbird. Again, very hard to find, but Arturo knew where to find them. And it's a spectacular looking hummingbird, and indeed it's the size of a bumblebee. I'll show you some bigger hummingbirds later. This is Cuba's national bird. It's a Cuban trogon, and brightly colored. The colors are similar to the Cuban flag, I suppose. Every country in the Middle America and the Caribbean has its trogons, and this is the one that occurs in Cuba. Little anecdote on this bird. One morning, we were just leaving the the resort where we'd been staying near the Zapata Swamp, and we found a freshly killed Stygian owl by the side of the road. It probably hit a car or something like that. And Arturo picked it up and he said, well, I don't think there's one of these exists as a specimen in the country's National Natural History Museum. So it found its way back to the National Natural History Museum in Havana. And about 5 years after that, Liz and I were on our own on a trip to a resort not that far from Havana. We spent a week down there, and we thought we'd go over to Havana for the night and hit the high spots, so to speak, of Havana. And one of the high spots was the Natural History Museum. And as we went in, I said, hey, I wonder if that owl that we picked up is there. And indeed, there it is. So that's the story of that Stygian owl. Looks a bit like a cross between a grey horned and a long-eared, doesn't it? But anyway. And I love seeing our own native birds that breed and nest in my own backyard, so to speak, when they're down south for the winter. And some of you will recognize this as a Cape May warbler in full breeding plumage in Cuba. I like to think that this is one of the ones that nested perhaps in Cape Breton, and the following fall would head off through Briar Island, past our camp there, and head down to Cuba. Okay, the next trip I'm going to talk about that Blake organized was to Iceland. It was June 2015, and we flew direct in those days. You could fly direct from Halifax to Reykjavik, which was very nice. Can't do that anymore, unfortunately. And we spent basically 10 days going around the edge here, around that peninsula. The furthest we got up here was to another town called Akureyri. We went to this lake, which is famous for British birders. It's called Mývatn, which apparently is Icelandic for midges, and I think it's every European duck breeds there. It was June, because it's sort of in the middle of the ocean. The climate is not too bad in Iceland, even though it's called Iceland. The climate is moderated. Whoops. There we go. The climate's moderated by the ocean. The main weather we got was wind, which was cold, but it wasn't that cold. The birding in Iceland is interesting because there are only 3 or 4 species of passerines, that is perching birds, in the trees that occur there at all regularly. Nearly all the birds that you go and see are either seabirds or shorebirds or something similar. This was our trusty guide at the time, whose name was actually Trausti. In the summer, he does birding trips, and in the winter, he does Northern Lights trips. This was a typical scene just behind one of the hotels that we stayed at. These are nearly all full Mars, and there's a couple of Iceland gulls in the front there as well. Iceland gulls, by the way, don't breed in Iceland. Glaucus gulls do. This was right in the middle of Reykjavik. It's a white wagtail, common bird in Europe and Britain. It was easy to see shorebirds. Here's a pair of Eurasian oyster catchers right by the roadside. There was a nest, which we sort of kept away from, but the birds didn't keep away from us. Lots of Arctic terns, which nest there. This is a redwing, which is not a red-winged blackbird. It's a relation of our American robin and the European blackbird. And as most of you probably know, there have been a few that have occurred in Nova Scotia in the last few winters. And now all the keen birders, when we see flocks of robins in the winter, we always look very carefully at one of these guys. They're relatively common in Iceland. This is a willow ptarmigan that we saw. This is just 2 pictures of birds chasing each other, and this sort of explains why birding in Iceland is interesting. This is a black-tailed godwit chasing a parasitic jaeger, and this is an Arctic tern chasing a gyrfalcon. So it's not very often that you get to see all of those things basically within a few days of each other. We went to this place, and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it, but this was the volcano that erupted a number of years ago, and it completely disrupted European air travel for several weeks. They've turned it into a visitor center with sort of sound and light show and all this kind of stuff down here. The interesting thing was that if you look at this picture down at the bottom here, all the ash is going in that direction, which is directly towards Northern Europe. People were able to climb the volcano and look from this side and look directly down into the crater, apparently. The reason we went there, it's on the south coast, was this. There's a lava flow, which is solidified now, and basically it's like a big stone pathway, and you can stand on the side of it and watch great skuas flying by at eye level, this close. You don't want to get too close because they're quite vicious, apparently. Here's another couple of pictures of great skuas. We stood there and just watched great skuas flying by at eye level for about an hour, and there were a few parasitic jaegers in with them as well. The next Blake trip that I'm going to talk about is we went to Northern India in January of 2010. Now, that trip consisted of 2 halves. The first week basically was in Rajasthan, starting out in Delhi. And the second week was up further north towards the Himalayas. As I think I said in the blurb that I sent in to Susan, all the time I was working, I could never take more than a maximum of 10 days off. So almost all of these trips, I actually had to leave before the trip was over. And that was certainly the case here. In this particular case, I think I was lucky because the second half of the trip, there was a bad accident involving one of the participants. Anyway, this is, of course, the Taj Mahal, which to everybody around the world is probably the sort of symbol of northern India. You can see the crowds that go there. We joined them, which was just an amazing place to see. However, you don't have to stop birding because you're just in the Taj Mahal. This was the view from the back deck, or the back marble place, actually in the building or on the building. Lots of birds here. I'm not going to, there's ruddy ducks, and that's adjutant stork, I think. And anyway, I won't go into that, but you can also see how unclean the river is right there. This is just a picture of the old part of New Delhi. I'm glad I'm not an electrician there, or a motor scooter parts salesman, but anyway, we thought that was fairly typical. And we kept being told about this wonderful wetland just outside Delhi, with all kinds of super birds, and we went there and it was thick fog, and we basically gave up after a couple of hours because apparently the fog stayed there for days. I'm a great lover of Indian food, and in fact today I cooked a curry, and we had it just before this meeting started. One of the highlights for me for our Indian trip was the food, and I can't tell you what all these things are, but we had one of the most memorable meals I've ever had anywhere. Was outdoors on a beautiful summer evening. The sun was just going down. It was dusk. They'd rigged up this huge table with little bells that were tinkling. There were bee eaters flying around. There were huge bats, flying foxes that were flying around as well. And the place, it was on the outskirts of the city of Jodhpur. And the place was owned by the nephew of the last Maharaja of Jodhpur, apparently. And they kept bringing out plates and plates and plates of stuff that looked like this and tasted delicious. And it was just magical. However, if you go into a restaurant in India, that's one of the things you might see. Not quite so appetizing. Just three pictures that I thought might be interesting. This is in the city of Jaisalmer, not far from the Pakistan border, in sort of northwest India. Typical street, rather chaotic. This was some beautiful architecture. The whole city is made of sandstone. I went into a restaurant, and while we were there, I wanted to use the washroom. So I went into the washroom, and there hanging on the wall was this picture. These are Labrador ducks, which are ducks that went extinct, well, over 100 years ago, and were only described and were drawn and painted by John James Audubon on a trip that he made to the south coast of Labrador. What they were doing in that restaurant in Jaisalmer in India, I have no idea. But anyway, I found that rather interesting. We went to Ranthambore, which is a reserve for tigers, where you're supposed to be able to see tigers, but what we did see was monkeys. You had to be awfully careful, because if you were eating anything, like if you're eating a bag of chips or something, the monkeys would try and grab them from you. In Ranthambore, the group was divided into several small groups that all went off each morning in little vans, little open vans, to look for tigers. Some people saw tigers. We heard one, but we only saw the back end of one sliding into the bush. But we did see this creature, which is a sloth bear, which is an endangered type of bear, and which, according to the locals, they would rather see one of these than a tiger. But we wanted to see a tiger, and we were disappointed. We did go to this little village. These are demoiselle cranes, which fly south over the Himalayas, land in the area of this little village, and they've become part of the culture of that village. And the villagers go out and feed them. And the cranes have learned of this, and they they stay there basically for the winter. This is a little green bee eater. And these are vultures. Vultures in India are highly endangered. The reason, some of you may know, is that Indian farmers were encouraged to use a medication called diclofenac, which is sold in the West here as Voltaren. Some of you may use it. The diclofenac was given to cattle to basically cure or treat arthritis in cattle, so that their milk production or their meat production could be increased. And the problem was that when the cattle died, the diclofenac stayed in their bodies, and when the vultures came to eat the bodies, it would get into the vultures' system, and the vultures died of kidney failure. So this was, even then, was quite an unusual sight. These are cinereous vultures. These are griffins, I think, and this big one here is a Himalayan vulture. And here are just a few of the birds that we saw as we went around India: Eurasian hoopoe, red wattle lapwing, dusky eagle owl, and a sarus crane. The last trip that Blake organized that we went on was in Peru in November 2013. We did go to Machu Picchu. Of course, this is the famous view of Machu Picchu. It's a wonderful place. We made a bit of a mistake. We arrived in Lima. The following day, we took a domestic flight to another small town further north. And a few of us decided we want to go birding immediately. And there was a dried up lake at an elevation of 12,000 feet that was supposed to have 3 different species of flamingo. And it was our only chance to see them. So those of us that wanted to see them drove up in the van that we had to this lake at 12,000 feet before we got acclimatized. This is a James's flamingo. It's the rarest one and hard to see. As we were coming down, several people were throwing up. I had the worst headache I'd ever had in my life, before or since. Several people were sort of short of breath and drowsy. I think we were lucky that nobody got heart failure or died of altitude sickness. But anyway, we got over it in the end. This lady claimed that she operated the highest store in the world. This was also at 12,000 feet. By the time we got up to this particular person, we were already acclimatized. We'd taken things a little bit more slowly. And some people bought clothing made of this colorful type of stuff. Very nice. This is the Colca Canyon that we went to. It's larger and deeper than the Grand Canyon, and is the second largest canyon in the world, apparently. The largest is the one in Mexico, whose name I can't remember. The reason we went there was this. We were looking down. This is an Andean condor, the heaviest, I think it's the heaviest flying bird, although mute swans might be bigger. I think this is. And a bit later in the day, we saw them coming right by again at eye level. A fantastic looking bird. This is the male. The female doesn't have the white on it. Other birds we saw up there, this was a mountain caracara. And this is a rather odd shorebird that is a must-see for shorebird enthusiasts. It's called a diademed sandpiper plover. And we had to walk uphill quite a long way to see it. And we were already at over 10,000 feet, so it was very hard going. We spent a couple of days at Lake Titicaca, which is the largest inland lake in the world. The picture on the left is it's the entrance to a restaurant we went to, and I took that picture mainly because it sort of looked nice, but it's also the cover picture on the Lonely Planet Guide to Peru. The people on the right, they live in these houses made of rushes. They have their own way of life. Apparently, it hasn't changed since the days of the Incas, except that one of them took out a cell phone and started using it at one point. So maybe it's all for the tourists. We don't know. Lake Titicaca has some interesting birds. The This is called a many-colored rush tyrant. This is a giant flightless grebe, which is endemic to that lake and is found nowhere else in the world. This is a yellow-billed teal, and this is a plumbeous rail, which we're lucky to see as it kind of crossed from one side to the other. We also, on the way up to Machu Picchu, we didn't go on the Inca Trail, we went by train, very luxurious and beautiful train, which dropped us off at the base of the road to Machu Picchu, a place called Aguas Calientes, meaning hot water. And the birding was quite good around there, including this female Andean cock of the rock. This is at Machu Picchu. Everybody was oohing and ahhing at the architecture and so forth. The Incas basically built walls where they say that you couldn't even put a credit card in between the rocks, but a few of the rocks did have holes in between them, and blue and white swallows nested there. This was an extraordinary place we went to. We were supposed one day to go up a mountain with our local guide, but we were told that the road was closed because there'd been a landslide. So the local guide said, well, would you like to see the inside of a house where the owners, still use the traditional ways of the Incas? So we said yes. So the house consisted of 2 rooms. There was a bedroom and the other room. The other room served as a kitchen and everything else, but one wall was the shrine to their ancestors. These are 3 pickled fetal llamas. One of these skulls is Granny, apparently. This is a stuffed dead condor, and I'm not sure what these things represented. And running around on the floor, guinea pigs, which was supper. So that was very interesting. I did actually taste roast guinea pig, and it tasted like chicken, like all these things do. Here are some Peruvian hummingbirds. This is you've seen the smallest bird in the world, which was in Cuba. This is the largest hummingbird in the world. It's called a giant hummingbird. This has the longest tail of a hummingbird. It's called a black-tailed train bearer. And this one has the longest bill in proportion to its body of any bird in the world. It's a sword-billed hummingbird. These were all in different places in the. We didn't go to the Amazon. We stayed at the Andes, in the Andes. And the last couple of days in Peru, we went back to the coast just north of Lima. There was a coastal resort where the birds, the beach was turned into a sort of a bird sanctuary, where we had huge numbers of elegant terns and Franklin's gulls, which overwinter there. These are Inca terns, very unusual looking tern. And this was special for me because all my life I've wanted to see a penguin outside a zoo. And indeed, this is the only time I've ever, and probably ever will, see a penguin in the wild. These are Humboldt's penguins with a couple of Inca terns. So leaving the trips that Blake organized, we had another trip organized by a Nova Scotian. It was Judy O'Brien knew the guy in the middle here, Peter Jones, who was an ex-Brit who now lives in Spain, was at one time one of the young hotshot birders in Britain, and still is, but he's not so young anymore. But he became great friends with us. And he organized a trip for Liz and I, as well as several other Nova Scotian birders and a couple from New Zealand, to Morocco in March of 2017. We flew to Marrakesh via London, and we went through the Atlas Mountains, which unfortunately, this whole area has now been devastated by an earthquake just a month or so ago, where there's so far been about 3,000 deaths, apparently. It was full of little villages and roads like this that were sort of in this barren landscape. You think of Morocco as being a hot country, but the mountains are very high. How are we doing for time? I'm just going to rush through these a little bit because I don't want to be too long. These are Morocco to a birder. There are lots of different wheat ears. There's 4 different species there. These are 2 different species of redstart. The one on the left is a common redstart. The one on the right is a Mousier's redstart. The couple from New Zealand kept talking about reed stats, and we didn't know what they were talking about until we realized that it was redstart in New Zealand accent. That is a rather plain looking thrush, but the clue as to what it is that it's singing, and it's a nightingale. You know, it's not Berkeley Square, but it's a nightingale. We saw lots of bee eaters. The one on the left is called a European bee eater. The one on the right is a blue-cheeked bee eater. And that picture I took on the right was in a wonderful place where it was right on the edge of this. It was an oasis on the edge of the Sahara Desert with a bar and a pool, and we could sit by the poolside with a beer and take pictures and watch these bee eaters flying around. Great place. There were a few raptors that I keep forgetting. The European eagles are quite complicated. I forget which one the one on the left is. That's a marsh harrier on the right and a little owl. So next trip I'm going to talk about is Costa Rica just before the pandemic. We went to Costa Rica. We got back like a week before the lockdowns all started. This picture shows the group. It's Costa Rica in the dry season, where at least on the in the mountains it rains nonstop all day and every day. This was a trip that was organized basically by Dave Curry, who I think is there. And these are all Nova Scotians. We all knew each other, and we certainly knew each other very well by the end of the trip, if not by the beginning. And the tall guy here is the guide, who is a superb guide. If he was a very good birder, and if he wasn't a bird guide, he could have been a professional stand-up comedian. He was just a super guy to travel with. So we went all around Costa Rica. We started off. We spent the first night at a hotel right by the airport, and in the hotel grounds there were lots of good birds. This is a summer tanager, by the way. And while we were in Costa Rica, we saw lots of different mots. There's a lessons. I can't remember the names of all these. It doesn't matter anyway. We also saw a lot of hummingbirds. Great photo ops. You can see the top left-hand one. It's still raining. There are lots of tanagers. The one at the bottom, there's a, I think that's a silver-throated, I think it's called. The one bottom right is a blue-gray tanager, which are very common all over Central America. They're almost the equivalent of house sparrows in some places. They live in cities and so on. We saw a couple of interesting owls. Two large owls there. Is a spectacled owl on the left and a crested owl on the right. Some mammals, an anteater and a coati. Once on another trip that I'm not going to say much about was in Guatemala. We went to the Mayan ruins of Tikal, and there was an American tourist with a purse hanging over her shoulder, and all of a sudden one of these coatis came out of the forest, snatched the purse and disappeared back into the forest, and she was terribly upset, not surprisingly. For those who like cute pictures, this is a sloth with its baby clinging on for dear life. One of the neat things we did in Costa Rica was go on a river ride. We went on two, actually. Just getting on the boat, we saw these are scarlet macaws, beautiful birds. A couple of birds that we saw, sunbitten and a boat-billed heron, is that? Yeah, I think so. And you can't go to Costa Rica without wanting to see the iconic bird of Costa Rica, which is the resplendent quetzal, which we did see. The place I liked the best was on the Pacific side on the dry side of Costa Rica, where we went up into the mountains and we went to this resort, which was up in the mountains, but then you had to go down a valley to where this hotel was. It was a lovely hotel, beautiful garden with all kinds of birds in the garden, great food. It was really very nice. On the way, we saw lots of swallowtail kites. These are the mountains, quite high, and we got into the clouds where it was actually sleeting. You don't expect to see snow in Costa Rica, but we did. Here's another Townsend's warbler, another example of a Canadian bird that is nice to see down south. This is a volcano junco, it's called, which again is only found at those high elevations, and a couple of hummingbirds. And these were at or near that particular hotel. This is actually a Tennessee warbler, which again is one that might have nested in our backyard, so to speak. This is a fiery-throated hummingbird. I like this picture partly because I once entered it into an online contest and it won, to my great surprise. And this is an orange-throated, I think, mannequin. I love mannequins. There are different species throughout Central America, and they're tiny birds which have a great mating ritual in which they jump up and down and click their wings, and they kind of go blop, blop, blop. And this is one of them. Another good bird that we saw at the hotel there is this gray silky flycatcher, which is kind of related to waxwings. Okay, I've been to Mexico twice. The first time was in 2001, and the second time was this year. In 2001, I went to the state of Veracruz, and I've put it down there because the reason we went there is that if you can imagine, just about every migrating bird of prey east of the Rockies in North America, including up here in Canada, migrates down south. They don't like to go over water and they don't like to go over the mountains. So they're funneled into this area here. And I don't have any pictures of birds, but I did take that picture of the whiteboard. Just north of Veracruz City itself, there was a rather seedy town called Cardel. And people from the Hawk Migration Association, and I think from Cornell University, went there, and I think still do go there, although it's been sort of turned over now to local conservation organizations. And you go up to this flat roof on the top of the hotel, and here are all these guys with notebooks and clickers, and every time they see a bird of prey, it goes click, and at the end of the day, they tally up the numbers. So this was October the 16th of whichever year it was, I have to go back, 2001. So it was 22 years and 1 week ago. The day before we were there, they counted 383,069 turkey vultures, 63 ospreys, excuse me, 53 northern harriers, 618 sharpshins, 918 coopers, over 285,000 Swainson's hawks, and so on and so on and so on. And these are the numbers for the season. I'm assuming this still goes on. They call it the River of Raptors because what you see when you look out from this flat-topped hotel roof, the sky is full of birds of prey coming down from North America on the way to South America. It's amazing. So the second trip to Mexico was this spring. We went to a place called Rancho Primavera, which was down, down here. It was actually in the mountains, but not very far from the Pacific Ocean. And it's a ranch that's been turned into a bird sanctuary. Here's what the scenery looked like from the ranch. That was late in the afternoon, so that's why the mountains look purple. There were three couples, Liz and I, and two other couples from Nova Scotia. And at the ranch, they have three little houses, or well, three houses, a little one and two bigger ones, that you can rent for a week or so. Well, we rented them for about 2 weeks, and this was the one that Liz and I stayed in. There was a lovely little town, very authentic, nearby called El Tuito. We rented 2 cars between the three of us. Great food there, all local and very cheap, all fresh. After a few days, we realized that we had fallen into a kind of a routine because it got very hot from mid-morning to mid-afternoon. So what we would do, we'd wander around the ranch birding in the early morning. Around midday or so, we'd have a siesta, which often involved drinking wine on the terrace, looking at the hummingbird feeders. And then in the late afternoon, we'd either go out somewhere or we'd go birding on the ranch again. Here are some of the birds we could see by sitting on the veranda drinking wine. That's a blue mockingbird, streak-backed oriole, plain chachalaca, and yellow-winged cacique. We were serenaded every morning by the onk, onk, onk of this elegant trogon and the whistling of a ferruginous pygmy owl. Lots of good hummingbirds. This one's a cinnamon hummingbird. And we had some interesting flycatchers. The one on the left, there were lots of these on the Pacific Ocean side of the mountain range, and we assumed that they were Pacific slope flycatchers because they had all the right field marks. There was the one that we saw actually up in the mountains. We had a guide for 2 days, and he took us further up into the mountains, and we saw one of these that looked identical. And he said, "No, it's not. It's a Cordilleran flycatcher," meaning a mountain flycatcher in Spanish. And I said, "Well, how do you tell the difference apart from the altitude?" And basically, you can't. And luckily, about a month later, the two species have now been lumped into one species. Now it's all called the Western flycatcher. They were originally lumped. Then in about 1960 or 70, I think, the species were split. Now they're relumped again. So we lost one species, I guess. This one was interesting because this was the only picture I got of this bird that appeared very briefly, very close to the little house that we had. It was a flycatcher of some kind. I didn't know quite what it was. I thought maybe it was a gray flycatcher, or maybe it was, can't remember the other one, which I wondered about. Anyway, so when I got home and I'd processed the pictures, I sent this picture around to a number of experts asking what kind of flycatcher is this. It's the only picture I got. As soon as I clicked the shutter, it flew off. And there were several opinions, but the one I liked the best, excuse me, I'm talking too much. The one I liked the best is from a local eBird reviewer who was Mexican, who said that this is a fascinating bird because it's a pileated flycatcher, which is supposed to be endemic to southern Mexico and northern Guatemala. And this is the furthest north of a documented pileated flycatcher. So if he got that right, and I assume he did, that's again a kind of a rather nice. Nobody else saw this bird, unfortunately, and I only got the one picture, but nice bird to see. Two of the houses looked out over a pond, which had lots of whistling ducks, black-bellied whistling ducks, and the ranch was the owner of the ranch rescued dogs, horses, and military macaws. And we went to a macaw breeding station, which was up in the mountains. And these were a couple of wild military macaws, very spectacular looking birds, quite different. They're the same size, but quite different from the scarlet macaws that I showed you in Costa Rica. The macaws are predated by collared forest falcons. This is one, apparently very hard to see, at least in Costa Rica, in Mexico. Well, we did see them in Costa Rica. We went to this place. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it. And these are Herman's gulls, and we went swimming in the Pacific Ocean. It was only about an hour away from where we were staying, and we were dive bombed by elegant terns and brown pelicans. We did see a few raptors. There's a short-tailed hawk, common black hawk, and gray hawks were the most common. And the last night we stayed in Mexico was in Puerto Vallarta, where we got the flight back to Toronto and then back to Halifax. I took this picture because I was amazed by the pharmacies there in Mexico, which somebody told us were actually a front for money laundering from by the drug cartels. But I had a very minor medical problem that I knew how to treat, and I went into a pharmacy. And these are the things you can just walk in and buy. Tramadol is an opioid. HGH is human growth hormone, which is only actually useful in certain rare congenital conditions in kids. Tylenol 3 contains an opioid. There are 3 different antibiotics here, and most bugs are resistant to all of them. Zovirax is okay, and those are okay. And codeine is another opioid. And if you really want to look like these guys, you can go and buy your anabolic steroids here. So I just thought that was, as a retired physician, I thought that was hilarious. I'm going to finish in a moment. The place I've actually been to on the most trips is the UK, because we've got family there. And that's the next place we're going to, because we're going there in about 3 weeks. This is a view of London from the London Eye, the big Ferris wheel. And this is what birding can be like in the UK. This is a picture of what they call a twitch. A golden-winged warbler from North America was seen in the parking lot of a supermarket just in a suburb of London back in the would have been the 2010s or thereabouts. And this was a picture taken by somebody which appeared in the newspaper at the time. These are all birders looking to see the bird. And that includes the people on the top deck of the bus. I'm glad I don't regularly bird in Britain anymore, is all I can say. But that's where the birding sort of listing and the sporting aspect of birding, if you like, originated. It's easy to see interesting birds, some of which occur here as well. These are in the London area. Black-headed gulls are everywhere. They're probably the first birds you see when you land in Heathrow or Gatwick. The duck is called a smew, which is a rather odd name. I was staying once with my sister in Lancashire. I'd arranged to be picked up in a car by a couple of local birders who I'd contacted. And when they arrived, they said, "Oh, do you need smew?" So I said, "Oh, yes, I'd love to have smew," is what I said. My sister said, "What on earth are you talking about? Is this something you stick up your nose or what?" So anyway, I said, "No, it's a kind of duck." So they're one of the sort of most wanted birds in London. Tony, you can comment on that. Here are some common birds that you can see without too much difficulty in the countryside of England: a stonechat, a wheatear, chaffinch, which is supposed to be the most abundant bird in the UK. Not so sure about that when you see flocks of starlings and also house sparrows, and a dunnock, which is a sort of, the other name is a hedge sparrow, but it's not a sparrow. And here is a bird that was common in Britain in medieval times. It was exterminated, but a very small population lived on in Wales, and now they're common again in southeast England, in the suburbs of, particularly just west of London, in between London and Oxford. These are red kites, and you can see them all over the place. We actually went to a red kite feeding station in Wales while we were there the last time, and that's where I took these pictures. Beautiful raptor as well. So those are the only pictures I'm going to say. So there are a couple of conclusions. Yes, there are birds everywhere you go. It is possible to arrange your own trip if you're careful. It's possible to go birding and also arrange other activities, like if you have somebody who's with you or a partner who would like to go shopping just as much as birding, for instance, you can do that. But if you go with a birding guide, you'll certainly see more birds, because the guides, if they're local, they know where to find the birds and what they are. Certainly, going to a foreign country you've never been to before, basically you're a new birder. It's like being a beginner again, and so it makes it very exciting. Guided tours take out the stress of where to stay, where to eat, and speak the language, and so on. But from now on, the list of safe places is getting smaller, right? I mean, birding in Israel is supposed to be very good, but now is not the time to go there. I would imagine that birding and the scenery in Afghanistan is pretty good. There are places in Mexico that you wouldn't want to go, and so on and so on. So safety is very important. It's also getting more stressful to get there. Last winter, there were only 3 places you could fly to down south from Halifax without going through Toronto or Montreal, and they were Florida, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. So if you want to go to Mexico or California or Panama or anywhere else, you have to go through one of these other places. The reputation for flights being on time and making your connections and having all your luggage arrive is getting worse and worse. And I'm paranoid about taking my expensive camera and big lens and being told that I have to gate check it or stow it in the hold because there isn't room in the cabin. So I'm a bit paranoid about that. So those are the things that you have to think about. Travel is certainly getting more expensive, just like everything else is. So my sort of final conclusion is go anyway, go while you can, have fun, have patience, bring back lots of memories while you can and while it's possible. And that's it. Any comments, questions? Ken, you've been to a lot more places than I have. Eric, so have you, and so on. So hope you enjoyed the talk.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Richard. Really appreciated that. It'd be nice to get out there traveling again some more, I must admit. Brought back some good memories of England and Cuba, where we had some fantastic guides ourselves. It's been fun in the past, and we've got to get doing it again. But anyway, what question have folks got for Richard, please?
Just wanted to say excellent presentation. I loved all your photos. You've seen so many amazing birds and gotten great photos of many of them. Thanks for sharing.
Thanks, Sarah. A lot of the early trips I did, either I never took pictures at all, or I took slides. And for about the last 10 years, I've had boxes and boxes of slides, not only of birds, but of family and stuff, which currently reside in the attic of our cottage or the basement of our son's restaurant. I'm not sure which. I have no way of looking at them because we don't have a working projector. And for 10 years, I've been saying, well, one of these days I must get the slides digitized, and it's never happened, and I'm quite sure never will. Anyway, thanks for saying that.
It's fascinating stuff. Come on, folks, you must have some questions. You don't want to listen to me talking on all night.
Oh, you don't want to listen to me talking anymore.
Oh, we sound similar.
Yep. Anyway, I don't know. Maybe I put everyone to sleep. I don't know.
I have a question. It's Tanya. Richard, how do you decide where to go for your trips?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah. When Blake Maybank was alive, he would sort of come up with these places, which I think were based on the birding, the availability of the guide, the cost of hotels and that kind of thing. And he would put the word out, and so we'd go. Nowadays, nowadays the primary consideration for me is cost, because I'm retired. But of course, it depends on what you want to do and why you want to go there. If you want to go purely for the birds, there are lots of places. The in place to go these days is probably Colombia, which is the country that has the most species of birds of any country in the world. If somebody said to me, well, I'll buy you a ticket to go to Colombia, I would go. But having been to several countries in Central America several times, and I've already seen probably 50 or 60 species of hummingbirds and tanagers and so forth, there are other places I would rather go now than Colombia. That's the sort of choice I would make. I've always had a bit of a yen to go to Southeast Asia. The birding in Vietnam is supposed to be really good. And there are other interesting reasons to go to Vietnam when you're my age. There are other parts of India. People who've been to Australia, I know Ken's in the audience, say the birding there is fantastic, and Sarah's been there as well. I also like northern climates, and if I got a chance to, for example, do one of these cruises through the Northwest Passage, or go to Barrow, Alaska to see the migration of Ross's gulls, I would do that. Incidentally, another trip that I'll just mention because we had great fun was when Ken and Jim Taylor, who some of you may have known, and I decided we'd go to Churchill, Manitoba. And this was many years ago. We flew to Winnipeg. We rented a car. We drove around southern Manitoba looking at the local birds there, prairie birds and so on. And then we took a flight up to Churchill. Now that I'm more into bird photography, I'd love to go back there because we were there in early June of that particular year. We did see Ross's gulls there. We saw a lot of other neat birds. And the birds there, you get shorebirds and Jaegers and all kinds of things like that in full breeding plumage, standing on rocks by the roadside, posing, Pacific loons, There's a small area of woods there with some three-toed woodpeckers and so on. So but it's a difficult and very expensive place to get to these days. So those are the sort of thoughts that run through my mind. Also, I like to have my wife with me when I go to places, and she's a birder, and she's very good at noticing things, but she also likes to do other things like going to concerts and shops and so forth. And so when we do decide to go to a place, it has to be a bit of both. So there you go.
Yeah, it certainly makes you want to start traveling again. It really does. Fascinating. And slightly off subject, some of you may have seen the note. There's a fork-tailed flycatcher turned up in New Brunswick, so that's not that far from Amherst. Tomorrow could be a very long day for me. We'll see. Oh, and we've got a question. If there's one place you'd love to go again, where would that be, Richard? Birding again.
Well,
just one.
Just one. Okay. Let me think. Just trying to think of the places that I haven't even talked about this evening. Actually, if it was with a guide, I think India. If it was on my own or with just some friends, it would be Churchill, Manitoba.
Interesting. Eric Ruff's got his hand up.
Yes.
Hi, Eric. Hi, Bob.
Hi. We had an interesting trip this spring. It was actually part of a cruise, and we went to Kirkwall in the Orkneys, and we organized a guide to show us around. However, she said, you know, can you have a car or something? So I tried to rent a car. I tried 6 of the car rental places in Kirkwall. Nobody would rent to me. So I said, well, you know, I've been driving since I was 17. I still ride a motorbike. Why can't I rent a car? And the guy said, well, I'm sorry, the insurance company won't let me. You're too old. So keep that in mind. We did have a good tour with this particular guide, but only walking around Kirkwall. So you have to think about those kind of things. We loved your talk, Richard. Thank you very much.
Thank you for saying that, Eric. I'm very cognizant of that fact. I'm also over 75. And when we go to the UK in 3 weeks' time, we're either going to go places by train or family members are going to be able to take us around or lend us a car. But it really is an issue. Something I didn't mention, and just another hassle of travel these days.
What you're sort of saying is, do it if and when you can, sooner rather than later.
Yes.
Because you've got to take into account the travel insurance, places rent vehicles to you, etc., etc. I'm still 20 inside, but not on the outside anymore. True. No more questions, anybody? Yeah, Ken McKenna. Oh, just a thumbs up. No question, Ken?
I'll ask a question. Well, I'll make a comment. In Cuba there, you had a gentleman sitting beside Blake and Kirk O'Connell. I don't think he was the bus driver. I think he was the guy that the Cuban government put on our van to explain the Cuban communist propaganda to us while we were on the bus. You think?
I'm not sure, but I seem to remember that person was older, actually. So, but you may be right. Yeah, your memory is probably better than mine these days, anyway. So you're probably right. It was the government guy who who had to explain all about how wonderful the communist system was and all the rest of it, and how proud he was of Cuba and all that kind of stuff, who came with us to some of the places. He was the guy that actually took the dead Stygian owl back to Havana.
I think Blake sent him packing, I think. Great presentation, Richard. Lovely, lovely. Yeah, lots of memories.
I'm voting for you to do the next one because you've been to more exotic places like Australia, and I know you're about to go to somewhere in Africa and so forth.
Yeah, possibly.
There you go, Susan. Contact Ken McKenna for a talk in the future.
I'll make note of that.
Please do.
Thank you very much, Richard. It was great to see all those photos. However, I've only started birding, I guess, well, the start of COVID, and I've been to Mexico and Cuba and New Zealand and didn't go birding once. So that's really unfortunate.
Well, next time.
Yeah, we've been to Cuba a few times, and we've managed to get a guide each time we've been there. They'll pick you up at the resort, take you out for a day's birding, and those guys really know their stuff. We were very fortunate.
We did that in the Dominican Republic in January. We stayed at a resort. The birding actually around the resort was quite good.
Yeah.
We arranged for a guide, and the taxi picked us up and drove for 3 hours into the mountains, and we had a lovely day with a birding guide and saw, I think, 7 different endemics, and it was excellent.
Yeah. It's always worked out well.
Yep.
So, any more questions, anybody? Well, as long as the technology and myself have got on, this should have been recorded. It says it's still recording to the cloud, so we'll get a link posted out for YouTube of this evening's presentation. Again, I'd like to thank Richard on behalf of everybody here. It's been fantastic. And good birding, everybody. Have a great weekend. The weather's looking good, and let's go and find some birds.
Yep, a fork-tailed flycatcher would be a Nova Scotia nemesis bird for me. I missed one by literally 3 minutes once. I was eating lunch, which was a burger of some kind in the McDonald's just over the causeway on at Cape Sable Island, and Alan Covert texted me and said, "I'm just down the road and looking at a fork-tailed flycatcher." So I abandoned the burger, leapt into my car, drove down there, and he said it flew 3 minutes ago. So we spent the next hour looking for it, and never saw it. We saw dozens
done that
in Panama. There were dirt birds in Panama.
We'll see how it all goes. Thank you
Anyway.
very much, everybody. Again, thank you, Richard. It's been fantastic.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Let's
Good night.
close this down. Thank you very much.